Okay, guys, shall we? Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for coming and making it look like a proper audience, which is a rare phenomenon these days, but so deeply and even triply more grateful for you having come today. Warm welcome to our three readers tonight. It's taken us a long time to figure out this date because of the various complications and disruptions, but here we are, and it is happening. And so who we've got here today is we've got Maria Sledmere from Scotland, may I say, and two Londoners here, Carol Watts, who we've been wanting to invite for years. Really, I don't know what happened there, but anyway, the date is here, and it's more of a homecoming for Kate, I hope, or may I say that Kate Kilalea, who's a good friend and also School of English alumna. Sorry. Yes, of course you are. Kate did. I'm getting confused. You did your PhD here, yes, with Adam Ski. Okay. So this will be also the order of the reading. We are now going to have a break. This is, by the way, an evening hosted by the Center for Poetry and Poetics, if you were wondering where you were. So this is a Center for Poetry and Poetics event, and we will sort of update you on the upcoming events after the three readings. So each poet is going to, or each writer is going to read for about 20 to 25 minutes, as I said, with no breaks. We've got books here in the front by Carol Watts and Maria, so they are on sale. As I'm assuming after the reading, do have a chat with the authors, and you can make a deal on prices, but they look absolutely delicious and wonderful in many ways. Right, I'm just going to quickly introduce the three writers in one go. Maria Sledmere is an artist, poet, and lecturer at the University of Strathclyde. Maria also teaches at the University of Glasgow and beyond form creative writing, which I can't wait to hear more about. She's the editor-in-chief of Spam Press, a member of A&E or A+E Collective, and recent writer-in-residence at the Grammar School in West Cornwall. Her latest books are Cocoa and Nothing came out with Colin Hurd in 23, Visions and Feed, a 22 publication, Cherry Night Shade, a 22 publication, and Sans Soleil with Fred Spolia, again a 2022 publication, and there is a fifth one, a String Feeling, that was a 2022 book as well. Now I'm going to have to ask you later how you've managed to write 5 books within a year and publish them at the same time, but it looks like a fantastic achievement to me. Maria's debut collection, The Luna Erratum, was a Dostoevsky wannabe book, 2021 publication, and also was shortlisted for the Society Scottish Poetry Book of the Year 2022. And she recently co-edited the anthology The Last Song, Words for Frightened Rabbit, with Aaron Kent for Broken Sleep Books. Thank you so much for coming. After Maria's introduction, let's move on to Carol. Carol Watts is a poet whose work is characterized by a deep attentiveness to perception as an aspect of ecological thinking. This was written by Zoe Scolding. Carol has published 11 works of poetry, We are not going to list them all, but they often collaborate. The projects often collaborates with, or she often collaborates with others in making and performing, such as with the sound artist Will Montgomery and many others. Her writing attends to lived and often hidden and entangled histories of extraction, migration, and community, from weedy marginal land to the planetary. For example, Dogfield, a 2027 collection, or Sundog, which was a 2013 book, or Where Blue Light Falls, a Shearsman text that came out in 2018. Her most recent poetry collection, Cape Town, was a Shearsman book, 2021, explored the UK south coast as a hallucinatory and adaptive zone of inundation. Carol is currently documenting the life of a seasonal pond in London's Blackheath, a place associated over centuries with protests and gatherings. Thank you to you as well, Carol, for being here at last. And finally, Katharine Kilalea is a writer who grew up in South Africa and moved to the UK to study for an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia. That's when we first met. Her first poetry collection, was Eye'd Leigh. It seems ages ago. It came out in 2009 by Carcanet. It was Carcanet, wasn't it? And was shortlisted. We were all very jealous of that at the time. Was shortlisted, and this collection, Eye'd Leigh, was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award and longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize for Writers Under 30. Sorry, I'm smirking. I just remembered something, but maybe I won't crack this joke. Kate's first novel, Okay, Mr. Field, was published in 2018. And it's not in the written notes, but Kate is working on the second novel. And just to say, I think you're going to be reading from that. All right. Thank you for coming. Just a reminder, we also have an online audience, and the reading is being recorded. Thank you for coming.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming, and thanks to everyone online as well, and for that really nice introduction, Aggie, and to Adam as well. Thanks for having me. I'm going to read just a selection of things from some recent books and something older. And yeah, I'm going to start with Saint Leigh because spring has arrived here faster than in Glasgow, so it was really, really nice to see the daffodils and the blossoms. This is a kind of book of sort of anti-pastoral poetry that Fred and I wrote in lockdown, a line at a time, like a game of chess, waiting for the next move, the next line from the next person. So half these lines are Fred's. That's the caveat. Saint Leigh. Ultraviolet rosas, spilled into formless unration of atoms, and we spend ourselves back. The day extends pause, folding up in lux ellipsis, hills and hills of recessional cloud cast depth between us, rolling one-sided to release it. All of I'm rain cast through fierce aureate disquietude. To not say hope this finds you, or nearest the soft motif of your hair, bright spots around the anti-solar point. Balayage of except champagne never sets. In a forest image, I cannot touch you or notify through light that drowsy reminder we are many. Something decorative in the cold soak of sylvan shine gives up its entrance. The long day composed of such stills is lying back from its voyage. To say all of the land escapes, an exorbitant teardrop, a teardrop. I have these ambient hands. I wring the leaves. What lights us into dailiness? Now a late tone plats the digital line, a hook trussed up in the structure of a gift. Otherwise birds exit plagal cadence like mirth. It goes like this, close to the image is, almost terminal, morphic loss. This sounds abstract. It's just outside. Here, the stupid idiom of bliss is finishing. Go off, I guess. In the untrust of trash, whose song, belonging to the lumen, you part from part. There is no biology, just the audio blemish of what we otherwise see of the sky needs us. I am another bridge to the acts of what isn't, never could map chorus to chorus. Assorted is content, its own mockery of what, like a bridge we'd wish to hold. Like it was possible to cross. The way you take one step on the ellipsis in my folded hands, back scattering the pollen, like nobody could delete this air. Supraluminal to less than message, tenfold these hours to the air falling, memory polymer. Up at the threshold, echo of contour, all thought, hashtag 444FFGM, twined with shades. The cat wrote that bit. Armfuls of bird secrets, cascade exterior to seed. What an entrance. Insides lack shadows, they just grow back, faucets and the male coats of city birds. At 5 o'clock with feathery exemption, back from the womb, I fly with my tiny children and a list of all entrances to fold in these ancestral paws. Save lunar daytime with basaltic supplements and dip in the soil. How did you get here, minuscule silver egg, as if to improvise lava as the sky, weld weight via sobriety? We take each other's iris from the database and run with it for inconstant commodity, hopeful, as the day you checked into the aviary with all that weeping, deleting my entry. To eat better air makes baby better. I send this up to warmth in you. You come in here, but strangely. It's just a few from Cherry Nightshade. Ivysaur. My weakness is set in echo pastures. Butch and Cassidy have guns. In the chronicles of the Orange Archipelago, we turn against all trainers, rehearse hypnosis in the kingdom of language. Weird how most of us speak abstraction and never grow old, just show up in sunbeams or die upon impact. My wild sister is rented for battles. Soon the flowers coming bloom, heart gold or prior to chlorophyll, grassy and monstrous. I overgrow gender, I make it green. Wasp Corp. Heaven sent Cerberus with a hair clasp of the corpses of wasps. All loam hello for digital frostbite. I can't get warm in this one cool trick. Stupid vitamin sweater is so full core to want to be stung and or bitten over and over, trellising my Lilliputian wounds. Forever chemicals. Curdled earthworms in glum organology of soft water, oxidized by the feminine urge to burn out, one dessert spoon per depressed person, the hippocampus of a capsule collection, stitched to destitute verisimilitude, you plus me plus Fordist Tom's applause, low estrogen, circle the garden. Gentle poem. A hummingbird heart is so zany, needs 10,000 cals of nectar from 1,000 flowers a day, garlanded with this fact, I have tried hovering to stop myself. Royals. I grew up in the shadow of another palace. Mama had animals roam the garden, into the bargain, had all their fur dyed scarlet, had worms. We ate nuts and berries, red hunks of meat culled from the state forest we couldn't believe in. Sexuality was our custom. I grew out my bangs for the paparazzi. I guess my love curdled bloody meringue or nothing, convinced itself light was the only value worth having, temptation of entropies unknown. Coaxing twig from the nursery, a crepe myrtle laying on your tongue, a tiara-worn alimony of young swans. At any minute of the day, tiny fish are eating the dead skin of my feet. Tiny goddamn days of tiny fish are eating my time. This is particular to the bloodline, you said in a speech to the governess. Our life is bleeding, a quiet hymnal. Under the plane trees of London, my love sneezes gently, a genuine Eden. I'm going to read a couple from Cocoa and Nothing. So this is a book that Colin Hurd and I wrote in a kind of email correspondence where every poem was inspired by a flavor of Ritter Sport chocolate, which is why it's square-shaped. And don't worry, not all of the poems are about chocolate. Maybe they are. Crispy coffee. Falling asleep with the light on, worrying my cuticles like a therapist, not dressing for anything, let it all bleed, vicissitude of thirsty work, sparkles of chest icicles when I ride my bike, the sky gone rainbowing, double the same, blunting my love, putting it all into salt lock, breaking off what crisps at the edges like the crop of the poem Cream and Keats. Crispiness is the apex condition of anything edible. Anyone could tell you, cindering in the darkling kink of sycamores, this illustrious shedding, the best I have ever done. Will someone prescribe me a medication that stops my inner child shotting espressos each time something happens? A tricyclic spirit to salve her nausea, selective reuptake of acorns, losing my toys at the mall. I live in permanent textual limbo, the bowels of my heart pulled taut, inferior vena cava, all the better to fall for. Honey salted almonds. This has an epigraph from Fanny Howe from her novel Saving History. What is more important, a diamond or an almond? Let me tell you something salty. Underneath it all, honey salted sweet nothings. Angel numbers for roadkill, always had a knack for idle talk, your insatiable ability to sleep in any situation. I supplement with honey-covered lozenges, wastewater of a paste of trust. Many ways to say clarity is not the absolute, better to just understand. The taste of knowing is hard as almonds and diamonds. Somebody emailed last night concerning the wrong day, perfumed with being swindled into affinity. Call me your modern woody rose, mimosa absolute, so irresistible. Another salt rinse. When was the last time anything literal happened? Car crash childhood, watching my friends become silver-haired and petty with a spore vengeance, sharing glass mitochondria in the image of a torsoless translucence. What burial do I deserve? The carrot or the shtick? Lots of the same blossoms of oil paint, all in political soup. Imagine saying this represented awakening and hope, a slag heap open to saplings, growing in cinders and sherries. Who says this is blanched? To be in the outside skin of a sister, wanting simple infinity, lemon coke and ocean calm, ancient misty morning cigarette, having a moat with you, meaning that dust has been in your iris, gold dollar, gold cologne, washing my honey self in the bubble wrap winter light, can't be coming down again. Ground to marzipan, blood sugar of the 0 hour, transmutation, chewing my vitals, tender quintessence. I'm going to read something from a few years ago, which actually Adam published in Black Box Manifold. I can't remember, it was a few years ago, but it's called Arius's for Lavish Matter. 1. Myself a disc I can't compact. Instead relay anecdotes about the cost of waitressing and several nocturnal glistenings. Remember, it was Coleridge who could not walk because of hot milk. So my shame is a migraine deprived of opiates, and mostly I unravel my uniform, steaming beneath the lindens. 2. In profile, much prettier. Every epoch has its scary techne. Dream where my mother reapplies lipstick in the restaurant mirror and my life is the tiniest violet smudge at the edge. Customers fill the sepulchral dark as other shadows, tuned to mystery, clearly in pain with better quality, keep warm. 3. Resisting the hot mathematics of football, down to HD and popcorn memories, hum of love and bike wheels. Honeycomb crunched in the back of my mouth like a birthday. These splintering words to be dressed and buried, most of human and more. A scalp massage is tentacle pleasure. 4. Shouldn't we pick kin that resist us? Dreadfully expensive, the wristwatch future of light that lets in silver fingers, threatening piano wires to whiter fire. Tweets accepted, the lure of the bright and Maytide familiar. Remember he was supposed to come play, but didn't and hurt. 5. An empathic blue sky, little organ donation around the rain. In the red, the muscular cumulus news fell away. Meat that thins without freezing. I don't want to look the way this way, cashing misery for mercury, cash in gin. 2 cold halves of a decent cup fail to function as ritual. 6. Hypothetical rhymes halo the bay, become powder. How are we now? The camera lifts the wax from your eyelids, startling a blankness of planetary lashes. No sweet work of skin was sufficient. Those silhouette girls with faraway poses. Switch off the desert, I'm not listening. 7. Rub my eyes around the fantasy cedar as if the sap stopped happening. Hydraulic thought as all the rage and wasting. Most citizen damage dismisses the winterized lanterns. One line follows the next, a nest curling up tight, the language of saplings. 8. In crispest best, street clover pales to lilac assets, too true of an elevator birth between ages. Starved in the dark, the poem's gloaming is a hollow in the elm of my belly, not to sprawl any longer the vitamin law of extroversion. I require such luxury of inherited messages. 9. So maybe Meredith's hereditary spells crested the gleaming seas, chartreuse, reductress of the cool semesters. Exceptionally latent, the corridor of aesthetic residues repainted a glorious yellow. All premonitions ring with red, a seagull eating a seagull. 10. Interrupted outlook is late night, tricyclic, opening your mailbox for ravens. Advertise a fresh electronic duo, treat us confidentially, our slick new remix made the radio. This addiction can wait until Friday as I add to my nerves undigested iron, no condition, popping kelp didn't help, am I yet shining? 11. Halfway to Brunswick and back, in lossy compression of monochrome era, missing you much in abandoned houses, cloistered green, nothing a shake of desiccated opals won't fix when the sparkler goes, death as fears and cravings. Some sort of wartime cousin, now a chocolatier, and I really don't know what to say ready salted with these red receipts. 12. My womb through the night was shedding to suffer the sheets as glass and the body's luminosity. I'd say the wrought metallic twang of the tongue. I pay for everything and the recipe stays central to rich boys, Coke and brand new menus. 13. Can I fetch you anything while I'm here? How is it this time? The cervical curve of bone at the brink of the plate, a balance I exact as gravity. What sorts of eternity do we choose for our labor? I was so afraid of orange, poverty, your eyes if they open just so, like beautiful eggs. 14. It didn't take long to recreate the opaque catatonia of sad hospitality. News of aniseed drained the pool. No one came. Chalked up to biospheric sequence and now receding. Is there bread with that? I spent 10 minutes sketching to change things. Remember, you can always sleep. 15. Didn't I say a dairy-free dream would deliver me strange to some home or another? When everything grew too green and the smell of the bluebells still deep in your neck like a song. A sort of Gaussian moment propels me, lullaby ever of red buried February, the alkaloid. 16. Coltan imbues each blade of archival lust upon airplanes. A touch. Some other pixelated dryad could tell time from the web of a spider. My primary accent dissolved as sand, then ambient. Each window of night became complicated, pasteurized. I could not acquire the nascent Tinder. 17. Fluorescence rises from the woods to a clearing of gilded tips, expiry dates, essays. These demented lands, where I love you in the drafted web page, a fractal synapse unsampled. Our hours as baskets of molding fruit, glitching seeds. This can happen. I like the loops of your voice, dust, the trivial starlings. And I'll just finish with a couple from Visions and Feed. Avalanche. I want to go out. Had I walked home from school to know it was honest, and this could fall to prevail, and reading your winter to shepherds, really enjoyed how love pins needles in a lido beneath cold foam, where sheep are a side effect. Am I lying upside, speculating letters from the unobtainable calm of your eyes? Violet, where I made myself sick. One image is orange. It is so unseasonably warm to full. Nude turmoil. I live because not sylvan appetite blissed. The difference is sounding capital city, resembling clouds. We sit here. You put cheap whiskey in my tea. In a way, you are a sibling to me. We watch TV. I bury this, ask what blue led us to misinformation, absorbing the appropriate wattage of light to work very lightly. You come down all around me. I dream seamless amongst sycamores that you're not gone, and the geometry faulted a land blink. I was told to write twice, not cottage my thoughts spontaneous into these questions. Meeting your eye, it's freckled with blood vessels burst. The gag reflex of quiet grass is sleeping. I make us an isthmus with alien snow in my name. Hyperbole of womb and halogen glow up. You are such a peach to mint your art, or juiced of glitch. If I could afford, the bell tolls slender, what thought? This is my Easter poem. Frank. Draping the astroturf fresh on my shoulders, bristling morning beyond our slumber. Bunny, today is the sweet day I return to my pills, the ones which really synthesize sunlight, make of this flesh the ghost song of pollen as in a story. To ask Bunny what they knew of the underlust of April, sweeter than cow's milk ever was. I know it is Easter, and I am sicker than ever. My lungs emit emeralds the size of eggs, and I am tired like a house being emptied slowly over the palimpsest of spring with ghost mail concerning the cost of oil. For a softer reason as the future itself, I would learn ballet and train my breast to cloud the many-eyed angels of Bunny's consort, my sickly tenement baby. My dummy heart doesn't know how to be international eye contact. This is painful. Better to roll me up in the grass belt of our bad history. I grass on the police itself to another somnambulist goddess who says I shouldn't bother the land with those sirens, shitting green anxiety, being old. Better to live in the tangent universe with time loops for breakfast. I love you. I love Bunny when they are the size of me, planting this kiss on my brow, bizarre as I own my own crime, breaking the psychiatrist's caress, wearing the grasses of my sisters until I am good for oblivion, eating crystal cashews at the movies, Bunny stuck in the teardrop of God's chandelier. I'm sorry, sorry, sorry. I'll just finish on a short one. It's Homecoming for Lauren Berlant. Many seasons will be again. The real sincerity tactic. Wish you were here in dream. I don't know how to say goodbye or tie my own shoes before it's all over. We're splices of starlight. The boys are coming home. We all precarious wormholes of each other are coming home through purple trees. Forget language. I know how to speak in slurpy or mild erotica of anyone recurring in biotic realm is to care for the occasional jungle bug, just like us, not knowing the loops of this letter for how you are leaving. It gives us wings. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Maggie. I'm really, really glad we did it. And hello to everybody online, and hello to everybody. I'm going to read from, to start with, from Kelptown, which is this book. It came out in 2020, which was sort of beginning to be in the depths of COVID. So I haven't read it in person much. So I'm kind of taking the opportunity to read the first section. Kelptown is a hallucinatory, inundated town, otherwise known as Brighton. It's Kemptown, where I was living, but I was imagining underwater because obviously the dams, which are chalk downs, were once huge, millions of sea creatures, and it was once underwater. So this is imagining a kind of inundation on the coast. Kelptown. Slippery condominium, finding a foothold, perilous to arresting here. Each green cell an inhabiting, each morning a remaking of us. How do I live, tenant amongst your long fronds, gathering the means to remain, my glutinous high-rise swaying, extending northward? I saw you southern amongst islands, your forests great and hospitable. Subterranean bark mimicking striated skin of whales, breaching cowries reverenced in terrestrial reserve, as if balance could be struck and mean more than fortune, more than my shaven head and a chance wind. I saw you in a western bay spreading sugar under seaplanes and container ships. So refuge lay in invited anthropologies of relation that might give me entry. None but fantasies of attachment, ballooning new galls from my limbs as if to compensate, made to become my own vacant property, as if a keening of orcas might echo more resonant from basements and kitchenettes, my studio compression, your real estate. So here I am, renting vegetal architecture, my body failing in form, perverse and vainly adaptive. I'm seeking you, unsuitable for attachment. Distribution is sporadic, but here is a home on friable shores built from inundate truths, made and remade. No stone to grip without rolling, depositional and uncertain. No holdfast place, yet we live here and daily discover this. Unkempt we are, sea hours catch us waiting while cat sharks strew purses more distantly, as if you might find poor returns scattered in the street. Keep your eyes down and scan for reward. Watch them, born again repeatedly, marine. The way the word unnamed became unarmed. The way a blow to the head became a blow to the heart. How cruelty warps the tongue. Yet the forest grows up and us woven in it, already fathoms down and singing cellular where the ground once was, and our words for world migrating. Our streets rise up like ribbons, oarweed, rooted tangle. Suddenly walking the vertical, finding ourselves swimming in uncertain light, gills breaking out to adapt, if only to adapt, without knowing what will right us without surface or air. Caught waiting in the doorway, he was shoeless. I'm embarrassed, he said, looking down, the way pavement normalizes as home, as if a shoeless state would be no more than to tread softly and then their sudden disappearance, as if all living devastations are rendered domestic in safe evolution, the next pair mutating to flip-flops and then to blooded feet, kicking water. Still he waits while the hours gather, those bright bubbles collecting underside. Fleshy feet, lost on the lee, to the receding tide, sounding at night. The absence of footfall and the screaming birds, their wider surround given up until arousing. But here, So much deeper the long chains sway, barely moving in the midst of storms and currents, or in the paths of predatory arrivals, thickets, marginalia from a childhood fable, thornless and accommodating. I can hear the scrabbling of limbs above, the wash in frequencies, informatic tones. Or venturing out ahead of anticipated dramas, rapid explosions of encounter, I drag my carapace along for possible exit, that game of covering the eyes, ingrained and delusional. So it is you here, hen, working your economy without touching mine, eddying past bondage wear, plastic buckets, ladders and seaside gelateria, the blooming neon, a fluorescence of night, pharmacies, provoking fury, this plying of energy and survival meets in the sea's measure, like we might all become supple as seals, rather than rock-beached, angry as we are, and make from this rush a shelter, by some form of Caddis principle, husk become home. To indicate a hope in metamorphosis glued to our living and buoyed up, bladderless, but constructing subterranean housings, that change might happen in more than dreams. Pure biofuel will become, mucilaginous thrust, resisting direction, capture, firing imaginary will, somehow holds out beautiful making, still. Held to place, unknowing, or by a bruise as darkening conduct under skin, showing up in small capillaries, past impact sparking a fretwork in red lines. Attachment building from hurt, maybe pain. At that point where you think something happened here, can't bring it to mind. Was it collision or did it bloom social from beneath? Deeper disorders manifest, inevitable constancies just waiting to be read. A system of ties, and the way the body shows its meter, unbidden. I woke up with bruises. Did you see that happening, or is it broken autoimmunity painting out its plaint, as if sleepwalking and nothing to show but sodden feet and briny pathways dripping over thresholds, my own ghost, now guessing at a haunted lifeline turned golden green, black as sunflowers, waxy, as that Victorian show on a beachfront. See what happens to organs where pleasure goes coastal wild, how we all suffer. What house is this now? Raising glutinous heights. It has grown here so long, chained to uncertain holdfast, with tools ranged in intent, rusting saw, painted horse, scaffolding and underlay, balconies refusing gentrification in the rain. She came up, flaring outrage. How would you like it if this was you, with her doing that in your street? Answer me. Listen to rivers and levels, hefting where fog rolls over. The undead are at home for local apocalypse, among the silent sheep, sheen of distant metallic seas. What is it to find this land removed, and with it a secure measure of tilt, mass and contour? How would you like it, she said, if you woke one day and found yourself tethered to the vertical, barely able to hold your breath, and endless drownings arriving oceanic, oxygen coming through the pores, and that too rare to speak on a miracle of submergence? Street commotion, a reminder of a lost world I don't need reminding of, where we built so carefully, unthinking, because our future tends to a beckoning as it tilts. Stripping out cellulose that keeps all upright, taking on transfusions. Suddenly, this watery home began to beat, a green heart, pushing out aortic, growing like a heart from a leaf, its vascular intention transparent as the entrails of a shrimp, seeded with human living. Red capillaries spreading through excavated green. Really? Is this us now, discovering substitutions or growing new organs as we may, our house throbbing with accommodation? Rivers of us return on a king tide, rehoused and newly made. Or this heart redundant for another living, spawning from habituation. So, time is cellular traversal and love with it, unbound, marshalling local memories, learning as we move or finding a beat. That it could rest us here, futures all aligned. That we could trust to calmer currents, knowing I might leave and yet care for you still, this world rolling through beneath squalls and ghost nets, entanglement sprayed into galaxies, moon tides, the swell eating into balance, as it has always done, lit by pulsing lanterns, ballooning and delicate, larger than human, sieving their delicate organzas, long electric trails, stinging signs into amnesia. I've forgotten what was possible since you left. The future is noisy in insistence and yet silent. At night, the trails of phosphorus pulse. Imagined land without meadows as it was, already broken to margins you did not recognize as a child. How do I move there? What is that? Now deep and submarine, rusting growth engines, hulks blooming chemical gardens, slow to return, tenanted anemones might snatch granular prospects, uninterrupted genomes, drawing from damage to discover affordances, bee masks, de-extinction, a combination of small wills, ravenous to maintain themselves in undoing. Animals continue seeding the future. Some evolve without a mouth to eat, do the dance while they're warm to it. No need anymore for this mouthing, this pathfinding, this fusion of tongue and feeling. You'd think living is all now beyond words. Yes, we find in simplicity and roaring the defense of meadows, smaller insects. What is common in this? Explain. So that's the beginning of Kelp Town. How have I done for time?
I wasn't checking.
Okay, so there's the leaf with the beating cells. That's actually a real spinach leaf with real beating heart cells. In a biological experiment, it beats. Anyway, okay, so that's Kelp Town. I'm going to move to actually small meadows, which is what I'm talking about at the end there. I'm writing a collection at the moment called Mimic Pond. It's an obsession with a small, scratty urban pond on Blackheath in London, which is a very large plateau. It's a flat area of land, number of ponds on it, but this particular pond disappears for half the year. It's a seasonal pond, it dries up. And most of the time, if you take people along and say, oh, here's the pond, they'll say, where? Because it's dried up, there's nothing there but a lip. So I've been working on this pond for a couple of years and documenting all of the changes, mostly through photographs. And I'm going to read some sections from this piece. It's a kind of walking project which took off during lockdown because I began to notice things that I hadn't noticed before, but also as a project with a couple of other people who Will Montgomery and Emmanuel Wakele, who are working on something called Walking in Air. It's a walking project, and you try and imagine how you're walking in air. And I realized that in Blackheath, when I'm walking in air, it's hugely toxic. It's right on the edge of the A2 kind of area. And in fact, if you breathe in the air too much, your bones will start to erode. This is that area of nitrogen dioxide. You know, that does things to your bones. So, I've been kind of doing a wide berth around them. But nonetheless, I am obsessed with this pond. There are a couple of epigraphs to mimic pond. One is from Thoreau on Walden Pond. Here is a mimic sea with its gulls. That's from Thoreau. And also I'm working through a thinking out of Tom Rayworth's work, Meadow. And the quotation I'm using there to think about it is, infinity so soon itself a limit to objects forced into subdivision as if words named themselves. So each poem is called Pond, and it has a bracket with a word after it, which is a slightly random word. The only other thing I need to say is that there is a hallucinatory dimension to this. So also, and I have been accompanied by a wolf in the early parts of each section, mainly because I kind of was. And the other part is that the police during lockdown used to park up by the tea hut, which is right by the pond, the dog section and the dog unit. Both used to kind of hang out. They've stopped now. But they were there for quite a long time. So each beginning of each part of Mimic Pond starts with the dog section. So I'm going to read the first dog section and then some other parts. Pond, dog section. It was a wolf that led me to the heath, slinking, waiting at the turn. I was grateful for its waiting. I had seen it choose to get up on the couch. I would visit nightly to watch it settle, as if there was relief there for its neuropathy or mine, the difficulty of trust. It would sleep and find a kind of peace, enough to return to me in daylight, dreaming. Please come walking with me, I would say, now that you have found me. It would walk just ahead with narrow hips, snaking mortally like a dog. The day is up. We walk along a curve, tracing parabolas, slingshot around a pond's lip, sun at rest. Rotating black holes might offer assistance, but simple gravity affords us sight here, that unacknowledged shadow. A black hole, its bright and spinning vortex, newly pinned by earthly telescopes, revolves in space. In January, the water reflects my movement as we wheel, but not the wolf, who has a name invisible except to itself. Today, only the dog section is mirrored in the pond, fragments of lifting, bathing, crows. Dog section arrival seems a daily occurrence, folding over pond margins by the tea hut. The crows raid the bins as if in provocation. Lob it, arrest us. Sometimes the dog unit combines, framing reflection in police downtime. Meanwhile, water ripples and disappears. I've seen how ponds can swallow mountains, the presence of wolves, also the extent of sky, relative to the movement of the solar system, coronas of brass buttons, or memory of glaciers, their ballast of stones and standing waters, sea entering land, once looming distantly over isles of dogs, at that time when wolves became whales. Wolf is apex predator on the heath. What will you bring with your wildness, I ask, the recovery of forests around this scratty pond, or watery metamorphoses meanders through these black beds, still laying their gravels down? You've always been a child of gravels, it said, given to quarrying and percolations, but remember the poet, do not move stones. Infinitesimal monuments scaling time, a different order than walking in air. So many seasons held in a round sphere. Cut a door in the wolf so we can retrieve our dead. Another poet's maxim, I say, for a world that matters. I'm not that wolf. Listen to the roaring of ponds. Pond, diaphragm. Dry spring for a seasonal pond, Earth's diaphragm, a patch that weeps, now lush with clover and yellow flags. Reeds stand in for water, the stripping of a bed back to cupped intention, small stones, always readying for return as if by upwelling. Tensile accord with the way weather runs, the sagging or rush of air, slight moisture on skin or gorse blooms pricked darker red. Nothing is held here, porous to deeper saturations. Black earth naming the place it's levelling. A blot, condensing each day, drawing it up as if left by a downdraft next to the mound, its reversal into open mouthing or frame dragged, slowing us down to another extraction of time's deposits, the chance of voices. A cairn of small stones appears. A child cries, I didn't hurt her. Sits by the cairn unmoving, sound travelling to an indistinct mother. April. Now the stones have gone, returning to smoother embedding, shards of glass, as if polished by seas, strewn greenly. To skim stones in this water, you'd need winter to return. Storms are fat cells. Rain falls in grey skeins, unreplenishing. To skim stones would be to send them across space, twisting a horizontal plumb line, pulled into radial delinquencies. Send them skimming by this mount for trying mortars. History services as ordnance in curious trajectories, flaring as breath discovers barricades, a boundary mark, this pond, a diaphragm for reverberating margins. Pond, ear. Listen hard, cooler under cloud, to the absence of larks. Above the leavings, shells, seeds, bones from domestic dogs, pot shards, polystyrene puffs, a magpie feather with one white spot, bluish flint staring up wildly in herd alarm. Mallard on the distant bench becomes a wine bottle on closer approach. Its eyesight would be panoramic, continually moving towards and away. This ear, open to myopic resurgences, hears the whole sky. Sounds are tidal depositions, life beyond petitioning. In the evening, the clatter of maybugs, choosing this time to live, whirring under street lamps as if desiccants to the humid air, born of buzzing rookworms, a patience, given to prognostics and trials, cannoning into midsummer, make collision the principle of abandoned return, drone a word for seeking lost trees, other instars. Shifting of maybugs returns a dryness of remembered summers. That accompanying beat of crickets in the grass becomes straw, recalled now in your skin, an older, landlocked, living on ancient seas, reach of outwash, still drifting in me. This pond's ear vibrates at the rim, finds occasion for disappearances. The hay, lane long hid, shines blonde, lifts itself to the breeze. High-rise ragworts sway, watching for the silences of butterflies, absent blocks of air, as if sounding those deletions. Is this a poor year with so few to find? Sounds of our lack denied in the rush to flower, the fullness of plants unattended. Heat arcs like a drum. Summer brings velocities, beaks ajar, crows spread wings close to the ground, as if in full belly absorption of deeper frequencies. That time of explosion in our London yard, hawk taking out the slow wood pigeon from above, then hunched to tent what it had taken, eyes unblinking, golden, is not the way of crows. Congregating without the pinpointing of descent, they distribute severally or hang in the air, revolving on loud contention, sourcing black conglomerates internal to the breeze, where lightest principles of flight buoy momentary uplift taffetas. In May, they mobbed a circus, tearing holes in the canvas, dropping stones on windows, thwarted by the son of a knife thrower, finding excitements in gathering, in their clamour, a calling. The pond is yellow as a threshing box. The heath cracks there. Crows have departed for Folly Pond, raucous now in distant trees, shady water. Here there is a listening to earth, its ringing, as if the pond is resolving itself into atoms, ground and air, desertification in miniature, like an inland sea in a greater continent where ships rust on lands drained of moisture, salt sands drawn to the surface and gathering. Here the host of marvels, as if condensing, pouring from everywhere, a buzz and desiccate. One thing I haven't told you is that it's not just any old pond. It's a pond that sits by a mound on Blackheath. To say it's high, it's not high. It's a mound. But the mound is really well known over centuries because it's the place where, in the Peasants' Revolt, the speeches were given from. So if you're familiar with the Peasants' Revolt, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, those speeches were given from this mound. And since then, through all of the rebellions and revolts, that mound has been used for protest and speech and gatherings from the suffragettes and dockers and the Chartists, but also in the 18th century by huge Methodist gatherings, about 20,000 people, where you could hear the crying from about 2 miles away. So the pond material is wrapped up with that history. And so some of the fragments of words I'm using are coming from work, for example, by John Gower, who was the poet very conservative poet, I have to say, who responded to the Peasants' Revolt at the time in the 1380s, and who compared those who were rebelling to animals, but particularly to corvids. So that's why, I mean, it's not why there are 100 crows there. They hang out, they bathe in the pond, but there is a kind of a symbolic space for me here. I'm going to just read, I think, one more. Pond, pulse, life signs, boom, 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 bass notes of a bank holiday fair, gain interior resounding walking, shake, shake, shake. Moan hay sits up in peaks as if ridging vibration. Crows scuttle after insects, tracking lines of intent. A pulse, throbbing sun, then a night and day of torrents resolving into calm, small-scale erosions. Soil mimics fractal tributaries. It's hard to say, tributaries. Pond retains its empty reverb, fuzz of green, intimating waterless survival. Nearby, a struggling oak, loaded with ghouls, ink in tighter housings. Fall in step while your heart makes counterbeats by Splash Mountain. While August gives out, answering and resisting restless atmosphere. In Sind, 67 inches of rain fall in one day, joined by glacial melt, floods overtopping lives and houses. That line in Brecht, when to speak of trees is almost a crime. When to speak of ponds is barely a marginal good. This meagre spot, lean to aching seasons, captures time as a fitful spirit level, its dry blister punctured to air. In the distance, neon lights, humans flinging upwards. Thank you.
No, I could hear perfectly, but I wasn't sure if it was because we were at the front. So this is a new book that I'm planning to read a bit from. I've only finished one chapter for the purpose of this, and I'm really glad to have had a chance to give it an outing. Kind of forces you to put things together and rethink things. I remember Adam giving me the advice on my first novel, just do one chapter totally. And it took me about a year. And then I got pregnant and I had 9 months to do the rest of the 12. So this is chapter 2 of a book which is called Joy and the Invitation to Die. It was going to initially be 2 books. Oddly, we all have kind of spoken about responding literally to another writer and to the work of another writer. And this book was really a response to Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which is a book I love so much that it kind of evokes and requires a response. And it sort of takes the pressure off the writing of it a bit to feel that it's a response or a take on another book, not necessarily a product that's kind of purely mine. And I actually, again, I proposed it to Adam, a postdoc, on the idea of joy. And his response was, well, you're going to have to define that against what's not joy. And it was an interesting sort of idea that most of ideas about joy seem to be defined as a sort of absence of something that was not very joyful. And I tried to think about a way to do that book. It was going to be a series of essays. And somebody said to me, what do you mean you're going to write a book about joy? And I said at the time, I don't feel quite so close to the sentiment now. I said, well, I know that I experienced it once. And that sounds sort of a silly thing to say, but it did feel something that existed on its own, and yet something peculiarly hard to capture in writing, other than, I think it's Nietzsche who says, it's just not this. And it felt as though the ambition of this book was to try and find a way, I'm not sure that I've done it yet, but to write something that felt like it had some kind of joyous aspect that wasn't simply a renunciation of what wasn't joy. So it ended up taking the form of a character called Joy, who sounds like a joke, but is suicidal. And it's told largely from the point of view of a psychoanalyst who works in a clinic for suicidal patients, a sort of special suicidal clinic where they have this idea that people who are suicidal have expectations that are too high and therefore suffer from a great deal of disappointment. So that the treatment for suicidality would be to make people feel that, and this is something I read a psychoanalyst is saying, his description of a very successful treatment was that the patient wrote to me later and said, I finally understand I can do nothing special and be nothing special to anybody, and that makes me feel I can live unself-consciously. And in many ways, that's the attitude of this suicide clinic that is the sort of first half of this book, is that if people can only be made to feel a little bit less desirous, they will equally feel a little bit less disappointed. So this will be chapter 2 of the book, which, just to give a broad arc of it, the psychoanalyst is Leopold Leipold, and he treats this patient, Joy, but begins to feel a bit doubtful of his certainty of this approach, this sort of disillusioning approach. And equally, Joy, who is a call center operator in a complaints line, but feels that she has the capacity to do something kind of remarkable, he begins to feel he's not quite sure of where he stands in the doctor-patient relationship, and that he begins to take on some of her conviction. Eventually, she does commit suicide, and he's asked to. He's suspended from work for a bit. He's assumed to be. There's some question about whether his treatment has had some responsibility for her death, and he takes a trip to South Africa, which is where she's from, and where his generations back he's from, and he's tasked to write this self-reflexive, i.e., autofictional account of his work with her, and he begins to feel that this report that he's going to produce is not simply going to exonerate him of guilt, but is in fact going to be a work of great genius that will stand alongside Freud, but beyond that, the great writers and the great thinkers. So that's the sort of general context of this chapter, which is chapter 2, and this is a Bildungsroman, so it kind of hopes to take in the whole arc of somebody's life. Chapter 1, which I'm not reading, is where he's introduced to Joy in the sort of context of his colleagues. Chapter 2 looks back more at his history, and I've really hoped with this chapter to kind of capture the birth of a sexual perversion. It's called The Disavowal of Greatness. That the sort of idea overarching this book for me is, what do we lose when we give up on the idea of greatness? Leopold Leipold had not set out to become a psychoanalyst. He had not plotted out his life at all, had had no grand childhood ambitions, had never known, had hardly even asked himself as a boy what it was that he wanted to do. And although this natural attitude of his, which one might call a skepticism towards striving, found a home at the Institute, where, like Freud, his colleagues believed in acceptings that longings could not be satisfied, and though his work fulfilled him, which it did deeply, he loved the strangeness of sitting in a room discussing the miseries of the human condition. Still, he would never have said that he'd wanted to be a psychoanalyst, only that he'd obviously not wanted to be one. It was the lesser of two evils, in other words, since he hadn't quit and moved on to something else. And if this line of thinking had been extended, and since so many of his patients were or turned out to be suicidal, so that this was now known as his area, if not of expertise exactly, then at least of interests, and colleagues referred to him the patients who they'd given up on, those who'd once, twice attempted suicide, and would try again, perhaps one day successfully. If one had asked him, had suicidality interested him, Leopold would have shrugged, given some response like, well, at least my work is never boring. which didn't deny his own craving for the nothingness to which his patients were irresistibly drawn. And he knew about this, of course, since his training had required he examine it, but only exemplified by being such an unsatisfying answer how thoroughly the attitude I've described permeated Leopold's character. No, Leopold had not longed to be a psychoanalyst. It had just happened. He had, he would say, relentlessly in conversation, simply drifted aimlessly along life's currents. Yet if one listened to his talk about drifting along life's currents, which was a phrase he used often, or just going with the flow, another favorite, so overused it was almost his motto, one was confronted behind these idioms about aimlessness with the presence of this idea of this current or flow, of some vital life force which must not be resisted. And so in these ideas of renouncing wishes was hidden, was it not, a wish, a secret wish, a deep and fervent wish, the wish around which perhaps, in fact, Leopold's entire existence was oriented, that there might exist, beyond himself, someone or something that he could surrender to. But no, Leopold was not a striver. Nothing had ever called to him in the way, for instance, that his father had been called to by God, or that others had been called to by his father. Leopold's father played the organ at the church behind, or rather beneath, the apartment where Leopold grew up. At 6 o'clock every Sunday, Louis Leopold, which was his father's name, would position himself at the organ in the alcove to the left of the altar, and his son, often without his father's knowledge, would accompany him, sitting alone in the clerestory of the imposing Gothic building whose tall Portland stone spire rose high over the city. The church was gloomy. Even in summer, the stained glass windows obstructed the light and let in no air, but the boy loved the damp atmosphere. It allowed something in him to fester. He loved the earnest stone walls which had not been covered over with plaster and white paint. He loved the vaulted ceilings, implying the existence of a being big enough to require such heights. He loved the smells of the wooden floor and the pews and the damp flagstones, one of which wobbled, breaking the silence, as the choristers filed in 2 by 2 behind the cross-bearer at the beginning and end of the service, in height order, children first. During evensong, when there was little talking, he loved to watch from his seat high above everyone else, his father flapping his elbows at the organ like a giant bird trying to take flight. He loved the expressions of the choir in their long white starchy robes pleated at the neck as they sang, how they tilted their faces up and even closed their eyes, articulating wishes to be loved, cared for, protected, which they dared not speak aloud, yielding their reedy voices to the overlarge notes which dragged sluggishly from the organ's pipe. Sometimes out of pity, or perhaps necessity, since the curate caught endless colds from handing around the sacrament, Louis Leopold would be required to do more than accompany the choir during evensong. He would be required to announce the hymns, for instance, or lead a prayer, or even read a short passage from the Bible. On those occasions, he would approach the pulpit tentatively, hunching his already small frame even further down as if pressed by an existential weight. He would tap the microphone. Tap, tap. Hello, he would say, can you hear me? Which they could, since the microphone was usually still set to the volume required on Sunday mornings when the pews were filled with families, and even the floor space in front of the altar would be crammed with children returning from Sunday school, carrying Bible school scenes crafted from tinfoil and old sweet wrappers. The pulpit was to the right of the sanctuary. Behind it was the wood-paneled altar covered in a brocaded velvet cloth on which there was always a bunch of flowers, sunflowers maybe, or gladioli, formally arranged, radiating outwards from a vase. Behind the altar was a wall of enameled tiles arranged in a checkerboard pattern, in opulent Baroque shades, dusty mustards, purples and maroons, decorated with delicate scepters and florid crowns and fleur-de-lis stenciled in curly gold paint. As he listened to his father, the young Leopold would widen his eyes on these oversaturated tiles. The tiles were framed by a painted vine full of grapes, itself surrounded by sculptures of the saints installed into little alcoves in the wall, their marble eyes looking down at the congregation with a mixture of suffering and pity. Above the altar was a large stained glass window in a modernist style, the original having been destroyed by a stray bomb during the war, in which Jesus and his disciples sat at a table covered by a white tablecloth for the Last Supper. The figures' robes were formed of large pieces of primary colored glass. Their only otherworldly, or at least not ordinary aspect, were the hands and feet, which were longer than human hands, a fact accentuated by the lead lines which fused the stained glass window, which had a grid-like appearance, highlighting too that Jesus was positioned to one side of the long table, as if his presence were, if not peripheral, then at least not central to the scene. Whereas guests in paintings of the Last Supper usually show some anguished foresight of what is to come, the faces of the brightly robed men looked underwhelmed. Is that all, they seemed to say, or, oh well. The register was, one felt, less crucifixion, more dinner party, an impression heightened in summer when the sun set directly behind the church, causing the white tablecloth draped over the table, which was made of unpainted glass, to suddenly light up with terrible self-assurance as if connected to some cosmic circuit. Was it the picture's intention to take Jesus off his pedestal? It's not that important, don't make too much of it. Or was the artist just not good enough to represent anything of genuine significance? On those summer evenings, the boy would squint against the dazzling tablecloth, which offended his religious feelings, and lower his gaze to the tiles beneath the altar, only to find their depth and intensity now depleted in comparison with the bright colors above them. Since, for instance, the cheery yellow of Peter's robe turned the yellow tile below, which had looked like tarnished gold, into a mustardy-looking color. One saw there not just two yellows, but one yellow caught at different stages of development, a pure yellow versus its morally dubious equivalent, one simple and life-affirming yellow, the other slightly rotten, its layers of glaze, moreover, making it seem almost to ooze from the wall, which for the boy had a bodily significance associated with certain wounds he had since he was in the habit of picking, and intimated perhaps also at other secretions which he was not yet familiar with. Leopold's father would, as he reached the pulpit, read the order of service from the little black leather notebook he carried around in the back pocket of his crumpled linen trousers. He'd carried this notebook around since Leopold's mother had died when Leopold was 7, in a fire which broke out after the sheets she'd been ironing had spontaneously ignited. She'd been reading a book in her final moments, the coroner said. Fragments of the Magic Mountain had been found on her skin, and her son hardly knew whether to be grateful to this book for keeping her company in her final moments, or to hate it, since perhaps she'd been so absorbed in reading that she hadn't noticed the flames. "Have you heard the bad news?" his father had said to his son the day it happened, as if God or an oracle might have told him. And then his father stopped speaking and lay for several weeks on the sofa staring at the upholstery, remarking only, when chastised for abandoning his son, "So shoot me." And so the young Leopold was sent to stay with his grandparents, a retired judge and his wife in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by sheep farms, where he spent the summer on a camp bed in the loft bedroom of their large old stone house overlooking the sea. When he returned, his father looked thinner, and his aura of exhaustion had passed beyond itself into a kind of inexhaustion or fervor, characterized by this increased church-going and the new habit of taking long walks on Hampstead Heath, so that on most afternoons, Leopold's father would leave his house in a white cricket hat wearing no coat, with this small black leather notebook in his shirt pocket, returning only hours later with an expression that said he was not quite there, or the opposite, that the world was no longer quite there for him. Louis Leopold would stand at the pulpit, not in his Sunday best then, but this cricket outfit, the white hat which he almost never took off, and a pair of crumpled linen trousers, or corduroy if the weather was bitter, and a washed-out brown T-shirt of which he had several, each with identical sweat patches under the sleeves. Sometimes, although there was no sermon at evensong, Louis Leopold would add a few words, reflections as he called them, of his own to the service, which was unusual for a layman, but who, apart from the choir master or the few elderly congregants on the front pews, was there to object. More than once, in these little reflections of Leopold's father, he would return to his boyhood, relating biblical questions to scenes from the small South African town where he'd grown up. He would not name the town itself. It was so small, he'd say, and so far away they'd almost certainly not have heard of it. And his descriptions of it were so sparse, just bushes, he said, just dry bushes and dry shrubs as far as the eye could see, that it hardly sounded real, less like a natural place, the boy thought, than a kind of imaginary nowheresville, modeled on biblical wildernesses in which often God would show himself. More than once, in fact, the little boy up in the clerestory wondered at the extent to which his father's reflections were constrained by reality. Not least when the stories turned to a man who'd lived on the outskirts of the village, named Dr. Inchi Baba. He was a herbalist, said Louis Leopold, a miracle healer who could identify the most mysterious illness, bilharzia cancer, a spinal fracture down to the exact location of the affected vertebra, simply by pulling apart a person's eyelid and examining their eyeball with a giant microscope. Having diagnosed his patient, the doctor would, the congregation learned, concoct a mixture of herbs and powders from large brown bottles lining the wall of his consulting room. And within weeks, months, days perhaps, the patient was cured. This Inchi Baba, or Dr. Barkis, clearly attracted Louis Leopold because he mentioned him several times. The young Leopold loved his father's parables because that's how he thought of them, as parables about Inchi Baba, and he would listen with unusual receptivity to how the tireless Dr. Barkis had worked right up until the day he died, and how, because he'd had no telephone, patients would queue up from dawn outside his farmstead, and Dr. Barkis would work into the night, not closing his clinic until the last patient was seen. The little Leopold loved to hear how the herbs and plants which grew on the pavement outside Dr. Barkis's house, lavender, clove, jasmine, rose, his father said, always in this exact order, were tended to by the large old doctor who midway through an appointment would emerge from his consulting room in this large white coat if one of the large brown glass bottles lining his workshop turned out to be empty, and beat this or that bush, bash, 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 with a broom, causing the dry leaves to fall, refusing to use leaves that were not ripe enough for the mixtures he made with his pestle and mortar over the sink in his workshop. Dr. Barkis, the boy heard, loved these bushes so much that he would go out daily in the midday heat to rub them with a protective oil, so that even in the height of summer or in the severest drought, they would not get burnt, would not get even the slightest bit crispy. He talked to his plants, apparently, as he applied this homemade plant sunscreen. Presumably it was bush, bush, bush that he said as he massaged their branches. Bush, you are a bush. But the thickness of his accent, said Louis Leopold, flattened the U into an I, so that he seemed to be saying bish, bish, bish. Louis Leopold circled his thumb and forefinger as he spoke to show how the doctor had applied oil to the little nibs where the new leaves would sprout. Bish, 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 he said in a soft, breathy voice, this voice of his which he never made an effort to enlarge. Bish, 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 he said repeatedly, with great significance, until his son in the clerestory could not bear it and began to sweat profusely, feeling, because he was just sitting there doing nothing, that it must be his father's perspiration that was coming out through his armpits. One Sunday evening, having recited a passage about Moses and the miracle of the burning bush, Leopold's father opened his black notebook and, tipping his cricket hat back so that it hung between his shoulders, began a story about a woman called Hannah. Hannah, began Louis Leopold, looking with his wiry white hair and long white beard pointing in opposite directions like an Old Testament prophet, Hannah came to town one Tuesday to see Dr. Barkis. She arrived very early, at 3 or 4 or 5 a.m., and stood for hours waiting on the pavement outside his gate, coughing a terrible cough because it was a cancer that she had, a bad kind of the throat. And as she stood there, he said, she heard a voice. Hannah, it said Louis Leopold, and his pitch, as he gave voice to this voice, had risen by a decibel. It was higher, lighter, almost feminine sounding, so that the boy immediately started and leant forward to confirm it was in fact his father speaking. Hannah turned, said Louis Leopold, and saw nothing, only this bush on the pavement. Hannah, said the elevated voice, which was Leopold's father's voice, of course, but speaking for or spoken through by the voice of this bush, itself the mouthpiece, of course, since it goes without saying that a bush cannot talk, for some other kind of being. Who's there? Asked Hannah. Me, said Leopold's father, so faintly in his 3-in-1 voice that he hardly seemed to want to be heard. Who are you? Said Hannah. I am I, said the bush lightly. I am who I am, it said in its twisty, seductive way. I will be who I will be. And then take off your sandals, it said. She took off her sandals, said Louis Leopold, though the soles of her feet must have been burning on the pavement. "Where are you?" asked Hannah. "I'm here," said the voice. "Where?" she said. "Here," said Leopold's father, his voice amplified by the microphone as if addressing an audience far beyond or far greater than the few elderly congregants preparing for the life to come. "Liar," cried out Hannah, "there's nothing here," to which the voice replied, "Look," in its low way, "in the air," which they all did then, all of them sitting in the church, because the voice was authoritative, because it addressed wishes which they ought to have given up on but hadn't. Their eyes flickered for a moment to the ceiling, and then, because there was nothing there, of course, it was just a story, lowered in mutinous, uncomprehending resentment. "And all at once," said Louis Leopold, "something began to happen. Nothing much at first," he said, "just a cough, Hannah's usual cough, but deeper than usual and more persistent. She coughed and would not stop, and had in the end such a tremendous fit of coughing that she could hardly breathe. Tears were streaming out of her eyes and pouring down her cheeks and dropping onto the pavement. Her chest had puffed alarmingly outwards as if to explode, and the blood rushed to her face, and in the moments before her eyes went dark, she said she heard the words, 'Hannah, Hannah, the great divide.'" "Hannah," said Louis Leopold, his voice reverberating through the pews so that his son in the clerestory felt his thighs and even his ribs stirring. "Hannah, Hannah, the great divide. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 5, 4, under the ground, 5, 4. Here the voice of Leopold's father or the bush trailed off breathlessly. "And the next thing she knew," said Louis Leopold, "she woke on the pavement with a spongy mass in front of her. It was the tumor. She'd spat it out on the pavement. Unusual, doctors said, but not unheard of in tumors of that kind which grow on stalks. Wonderful, yes, but not a miracle." "We don't believe in miracles these days," said Louis Leopold. "Not unheard of, we'd say to Moses, for a bush to spontaneously combust. You don't need a god for that kind of thing. I mean, it happens every summer in Australia. A bush talking in tongues? No, that does not astound us. That Moses guy needs help, we'd say. He's had a bottle of Blanc." There was a row of clerestory windows across from the pew where the young Leopold sat. They showed from left to right the closing scenes of Jesus' life. He blessed the disciples, carried the cross, stood trial, washed the feet of the disciple, before arriving at an image which seemed out of sync with the rest of the narrative. The window showed two men in the Garden of Gethsemane. They lay together, one behind the other, the head of one resting on the arm of the other, which stretched into the foreground. Their eyes were closed. The men were disciples, presumably, Peter, perhaps, and John, though it was hard to say because their clothes, if they wore any, were covered over by a swathe of brightly coloured flowers, or what looked like flowers, though they had a swollen quality, like jellyfish. The boy, who knew nothing about art, looked at the window with deep participation, feeling with a part of himself that one might call intuition, a certainty that he understood its significance. What this significance was, he could not say, but he just knew, that there was something more to their closed eyes than sleep, that they had yielded to something greater than exhaustion, the idea of which, although beyond the capacity of his 8-year-old mind, charged his thoughts which raced around in his head before landing on something which, though unclear, was something along the lines of, perhaps father would like to be held like that, so lonely since mother died. A thought which didn't feel right, though of course it was wrong to think the thought wrong, since God knew everything, great and small, including all that was in his heart, so that these feelings and the thoughts they aroused, rather than being a glitch, were in fact sanctioned by God, even placed there by God for him to experience. But why did God want him to feel this way? And what could he do, the little boy wondered, with this feeling that God had given him? He averted his eyes, the averted eyes indicating his intention to stop thinking, to abandon such thoughts to the mystery of faith. "Oh, little fellow," he said to himself, though it was not himself that he was referring to, but these little thoughts of his, because that's how he thought of them, these thoughts he had up in the clerestory, as his little fellows, all curled up there in his private world. "God be in my head and in my understanding," the choir began to sing, and the boy, who was still charged with the feeling of inner liveliness, which, were he a musician or a vocalist, he would have expressed by singing or picking up an instrument, felt something opening up, felt that he'd open his heart, even as he felt quite certain that his heart could never be opened wide enough. He closed his eyes and invited God into him, not just into his head and his eyes and his heart, but his nose and his mouth. He invited God to fill his every hair and every pore, every nerve and every sinew, every limb and every muscle, every vein and every joint, every thought and every dream, every tissue and every crevice. Invited God into every part of his being, into every inch of him, into his every conceivable dimension. He longed for God to be in his every hour and every minute, then and in the years and in the light years to come. And when the hymn ended, the saints above the altar looked down at him from their heights with their pious and anesthetized eyes, and he wished, even as he felt his chest tighten and his face with embarrassment or anger or regret growing red, for God to take him in his arms and suck the life out of him. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. I'm not sure I should say anything. That should be the last line for tonight. But coming back to reality, thank you so much for coming, all of you. And I'm just looking at the online audience as well. It's really nice to see some familiar faces, especially if your cameras were turned on, but they aren't. But anyway, it's lovely to see you all. I just wanted to say that we're going to have a few weeks, the Easter break, spring break, and we'll be back on the 27th of April, but it's a purely online reading with Banu Kapil, and then two major May events in person. One of them will be a memorial event for Alan Halsey on the 4th of May, and then there will be the final event. So sorry, not quite the final, because we will have a Claire's event as well on the...
On the 2nd, Vanessa University is going to speak. She's a short story writer and a poet. That'll be really, really good, so please come.
And
there will be drinks also.
Yes. Some people actually get proper funding for their events. Sorry. And the final reading for this academic year will be the 11th of May. I will let you know about the readers soon. So just one more time, could we say a huge thank you to Maria, Kate and Carol for coming to read for us. Thank you so much.